It is impossible for us to imagine the emotional roller coaster that must have been endured by Daniel and his three young friends. They had lived all of their lives in one of the most spiritual times in the history of the Jews. In the 6 decades before they were born, King Manasseh and King Amon had brought idols into Solomon's glorious temple. Yet Daniel grew up knowing only of the temple worship which Josiah had restored. For the 2 decades before they were taken to Babylon, the worship of God had been restored, and they knew nothing of idol worship. If you marvel at Daniel's faith, remember that the world in which he lived was a world where the Jews faithfully served God. But 3 years after King Josiah's death, Daniel was taken by Nebuchadnezzar to serve in Babylon. These young men were taken in the initial wave of Babylon's conquering of the kingdom of Judah. And the purpose of this was to take these young men and to train them for diplomatic service, to prepare them so that when the remainder of the Jewish people were brought to Babylon, that there would be some of their own people there to instruct them and to guide them in the Babylonian ways. But that roller coaster of faith was brought upon these four young men very quickly, for they were taken into a world that was very much so wrapped up in idol worship. It was a pagan world that was saturated with immorality around every corner. After Daniel and his friends arrived in Babylon, idol worship began to flourish once again because of the new kings, the sons of Josiah. Nebuchadnezzar would soon make two more assaults against Israel and then would finally destroy this holy city. Jeremiah was in Jerusalem and watched as Jerusalem was filled with these false prophets. They prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar would return the holy temple vessels taken from the temple and would then be defeated by the Jews. Well, these prophets were courageously confronted by Jeremiah for 23 years. Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 3. But the world in which Daniel had been reared no longer existed. Sin had returned to Judah, and God had sent the sword, famine, and pestilence to try to get the Jews to see his judgment and to return to him. Jeremiah sent a letter to those Jews who had already been taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. It specifically told them that they would be in Babylon for 70 years. But then the prophet told them of God's purpose. In Jeremiah 29 and verse 11, he says, I know the thoughts I have toward you, to give you a future and a hope. 2 chapters later, in Jeremiah 31 and verse 17, God said, there is hope in your future, that your children shall come back to their own borders. But how could there possibly be hope? The temple was destroyed, the city was leveled and lay in ruins. The only physical connection that Daniel could have had with Jerusalem was to go to his window every day and pray in the direction of that once great city. So how could there be any hope when Nebuchadnezzar was demanding that all of those in Babylon worship him, to bow down before a graven image of himself? So how were they to maintain their faith? How were they to retain this hope that better days would come? Well, friends, there is no physical evidence, and they were not presented with any promises that they would ever return to Jerusalem. There was no promise that they would be the ones that would be allowed to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So how could there be hope in such a hopeless situation? The answer is very simple. God promised them a future, and God cannot lie. It may be today that you are facing one of these roller coasters of faith. It may be that things are taking place in your life today that have you in what seems to be a hopeless condition. You look at your life and the things that are transpiring and you see nothing good happening. Well, remember this. God cannot lie. God brings hope. Turn to Him. During the difficult times of life that you face, lean upon Him in both the good and the bad, and you will find that hope will be retained, just as with these young men in Babylon.
Thank you for joining us for our program today. We pray that God blesses you with a wonderful day. And I would love to extend an invitation to you to join us in services Sunday at Pyburn Street Church of Christ. We meet at 9:50, and again at 6 o'clock in the evening. And also, I encourage you to join us on Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock. And our speaker next Wednesday, June the 26th, will be Brother Steve Prestige of the Black Rock Church of Christ. I hope everyone has a wonderful day today.